This extreme piece was made by Juan de Pareja. He was a European from Spain, and he was involved in the Renaissance. His artworks, you can see, depict very typical European styles, but he was not European. In fact, most of these works were made while he was in the capture of other Europeans, as he was a black Moor. Described by others as a Moor, even though he was not a Muslim, it makes it quite obvious that at this time, or maybe even any time, they didn't consider Moors to just be Muslims, even though at some point there was that transformation, as you can see in my video about Africa, where they don't just call everybody a Moor, and there are some Moors even in Mozambique. This painter, who was a slave and was mixed race, obviously had a hard upbringing, but still found a way to paint these crazy, beautiful images. His slaver was one Diego Velázquez, and he painted not only portraits of himself, but portraits of his slaves, including Juan. In fact, it's because of him that we know exactly what he looks like. Ironically, this guy who was a master of painting did not want him, Juan, to get into the art of painting for some reason. From the Met, we read, between 1649 and 1651, Velázquez traveled to Italy with Juan de Pareja, a man of African descent, born in southern Spain, who was enslaved in Velázquez's studio and household for at least 2 decades. According to an early biography, shortly after arriving in Rome, Velázquez exhibited this portrait, which was so like him and so lively that when he sent it by means of Pareja himself to some friends for their criticism, they just stood looking at the portrait in admiration and wonder, not knowing to whom they should speak or who would answer. Within months of completing it, Velázquez signed papers that would liberate Perea by 1654, paving the way for his own successful career as a painter in Madrid. Enslaved artisanal labor was widespread in the workshops of Spanish painters, sculptors, silversmiths, and woodworkers at the time. Even though this painting has Jesus in it, and so it might at first glance appear to be old to some people in terms of the time period that it's portraying, it's actually not. As you can see, right at the corner, you can see Juan himself being portrayed, and I'm going to assume that the rest of the people who are being portrayed here are some of the people that he knew, as they are also drawn modern. What's interesting about this painting is that nobody seems to be that shocked about Jesus appearing inside of this room. This painting is called The Calling of St. Matthew. Now, everyone in this room is clearly looking at the direction of Jesus, except two people. One is staring directly at what I would call the camera, but obviously there's no camera back then. But there's a person standing next to him who's staring at him. Who is that person? Some people are clearly wearing hats that would indicate Islam, or hats that would be associated with the Arab world, and others are dressed like typical Christians. Now, I did mention that he was a Moor, and there's something important about this because Juan was a Christian. So, if he was a Christian, what does this have to do with him being a Moor? Well, if we go back all the way to Astronomica, remember, there's a part there that says that Moors are named because of the color of their skins. The sun god dries up with dust the tribes of Africans amid their desert. The Moors
derive their name from their faces and their identity proclaimed by the color of their skins.
Given that this was written 600 years before Islam even existed, it must be pretty obvious that they're not talking about the people of Islam. Not only that, he says the color of their skins. Well, the people that a lot of people call the Muslims that took over that area and the ones they show, the ones they depict in pictures, not the Moors, but necessarily, but the pictures they show, those people are just as light as the Europeans. Those are Arabs. But forget that for a second. Some people say that this word Moor means Western. What? How does that fit in with what this guy just said? Manilios from Astronomica. But I'm not here to discuss Moors. Let's go back to the paintings of Juan. This painting by Velázquez of Juan was made while he was still in captivity. So there is some argument to be made that he was not treated as badly as some people would be treated in places like Brazil or any of those places, because over here he looks quite noble. Now, of course, being a slave is not a good thing, no matter how you're treated. He would go on to be released, earning his freedom by displaying his skills as an artist, which, by the way, that's something that people never mention how many black artists were responsible for Renaissance paintings, but we need to move on from that. And when he was freed, he was allowed to pursue his career, which he became successful, which is surprising considering that there's a lot of European born artists that were not successful. This painting is called The Baptism of Jesus. I've never heard of it before, even though it's one of the fascinating images. Now, I will say there's a lot of Renaissance images that I've seen painted by all kinds of people of all kinds of color, which beat almost everything that we've been shown as like the masters of the Renaissance. But if you look at those babies right at the top holding up a angel, it's actually pretty crazy the detail of this thing. And if you look at the bottom, you see people walking at the bottom and all this other stuff. How are people able to do this at this time? How are people able to draw things like this? Now, I'm not going to say, this is the best type of art ever, because of course I've said Africans had different goal with their art. So they put in all kinds of effort to build what they did, but just visually, this is crazy. At the back, people are climbing trees. Even movies don't have this much going on in one frame. Now, obviously, that's for good reason. The audience isn't exactly going to pick up on 100 things at once. But just in case anybody thought that this guy was a mediocre artist from the time, as we read, he was not considered that.